a man in a worn dress uniform, standing at attention beside a row of folded flags, tears in his eyes for a fallen friend. Within 6 minutes, he would be on the ground in front of 200 grieving families, hands cuffed behind his back, while a row of decorated military commanders watched in stunned silence from the front row of folding chairs. This is the story of a memorial service interrupted by an unlawful arrest, a furious phone call that reached the Pentagon within the hour, and the morning a single officer's assumptions collided head-on with 30 years of honored service. Master Sergeant Isaiah Coleman was 58 years old and had spent 31 years in the United States Army before retiring with a chest full of commendations that included 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart earned during 2 separate deployments. He had buried more friends than he could count over the decades, men and women who never made it home, and he had made it a personal mission in retirement to attend the memorial service of every soldier from his old unit who passed, no matter how far he had to drive or how painful it was to keep showing up to say goodbye. His wife had once gently suggested he might be carrying too much of that grief alone, and Isaiah had simply told her that showing up was the one promise he could still keep to the men and women who hadn't made it home themselves. That particular Saturday morning, the service was for Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes, a young soldier Isaiah had personally mentored 2 decades earlier, who had died of complications related to injuries sustained overseas. Isaiah had been there the day Reyes enlisted, fresh out of high school and nervous, and had watched him grow into one of the most respected non-commissioned officers in the unit, before the injuries that would eventually claim his life years later. The memorial was being held at a public veterans park downtown, an open green space the city had set aside years earlier for exactly this purpose, with rows of white folding chairs arranged before a small stage and an honor guard standing rigid near a folded flag display. Isaiah had arrived early, as he always did, dressed in his old Class A uniform, ribbons pinned precisely in place to help the family set up chairs and greet the dozens of fellow veterans who would be arriving throughout the morning. He'd spent nearly an hour before the ceremony quietly comforting Reyes's elderly mother, who had asked him, through tears, to say a few words during the service about the soldier her son had become. By the time the ceremony itself began, the park held over 200 attendees, including, notably, 3 retired generals who had flown in specifically out of respect for Sergeant Reyes and his family, men whose presence alone signaled exactly how respected the fallen soldier had been within the broader military community. The park had been the site of an unrelated disturbance the week before, a separate, unconnected altercation between 2 civilians that had required police response and left the responding officers on edge about the location generally. That morning's patrol briefing had included a vague advisory to monitor the Veterans Park for any unusual activity, given the recent incident, an instruction broad enough to mean almost anything, depending entirely on who was interpreting it. Officer Brad Holloway, a 6-year veteran of the force with a reputation among his colleagues for aggressive, instinct-driven policing, had been assigned patrol of the area that morning. He arrived at the park roughly 20 minutes into the memorial service, parking his cruiser at the edge of the green space and walking the perimeter, scanning the crowd with the kind of restless suspicion that had, more than once, led him to treat ordinary gatherings as potential threats. His attention landed on Isaiah almost immediately. Not because of anything Isaiah was doing, but because Isaiah had stepped slightly away from the seated crowd during a quiet moment in the ceremony, moving toward his car to retrieve a folded program he'd forgotten. His uniform jacket open at the collar in the late morning heat, his expression somber and distracted with grief. "Sir, I need you to stop right there," Holloway called out, already striding toward Isaiah with a hand resting on his holster, his voice carrying the kind of sharp authority meant to draw immediate compliance. Isaiah turned, momentarily confused, his mind still occupied with the grief of the ceremony behind him. "Excuse me? What are you doing moving away from the group like that? You with this event?" "I am," Isaiah said, his voice carrying the calm patience of a man who had spent 3 decades being questioned by people with far less rank and far more authority than common sense. "I serve with the family. I'm just grabbing something from my car." "You got ID on you?" Holloway's eyes moved over Isaiah's uniform without any apparent recognition of what the ribbons and insignia actually meant, the way a man might glance at a language he'd never bothered to learn. "I do, officer. It's in my jacket pocket." I'm happy to show you, but I'd like to understand what this is about first. There's a memorial service happening right behind me for a soldier I served alongside for years. I'll ask the questions, Holloway said, stepping closer, his posture shifting into something more rigid, more confrontational. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this park. You're going to need to come with me while we sort this out. Officer, with respect, I haven't done anything. I'm a retired master sergeant. I'm here to bury a friend. Isaiah kept his hands visible, his voice level, the discipline of 3 decades of military bearing holding steady even as frustration began to build beneath the calm surface. Hands behind your back, Holloway said, already reaching for his cuffs. This is not necessary, Isaiah said, his voice rising now, not in anger, but in genuine disbelief. There are 200 people behind me who can confirm exactly who I am and why I'm here. Please, just let me. Holloway grabbed Isaiah's arm and forced it behind his back, the sudden movement causing Isaiah to stumble slightly on the uneven grass. Isaiah didn't resist. 31 years of training had taught him exactly what resistance would cost and exactly how a moment like this could spiral if he gave the officer any justification at all. But the physical force, applied without warning in front of the very people he'd come to honor, a fallen friend alongside, sent something close to genuine shock rippling through his chest. He thought, in that strange, suspended moment, of every young soldier he'd ever counseled through fear and combat, and how strange it was that none of those lessons had prepared him for this particular kind of helplessness, standing on familiar ground in his own country, in his own uniform, being treated like a threat by the very community he'd spent his life protecting. I am not resisting, Isaiah said, loud enough to carry across the quiet park, his voice steady despite the indignity of the moment. I am a retired United States Army Master Sergeant attending a memorial service. I am asking you to stop. The cuffs clicked shut, and Holloway began walking Isaiah toward the edge of the park, away from the ceremony, the sound of the memorial's eulogy now audible behind them as the gathered crowd began, one by one, to notice what was happening at the periphery of their grief, the rustle of folding chairs and turning heads spreading through the crowd like a current. It was the honor guard captain who saw it first, a young sergeant standing rigid near the flag display, watching in disbelief as a decorated veteran was marched away in handcuffs during a service meant to honor exactly the kind of service Isaiah himself represented. He broke formation, something he had never done in 8 years of honor guard duty, and moved quickly toward the front row where the 3 retired generals sat, his own training screaming at him that breaking ranks was unthinkable, while every instinct he had told him that standing still and saying nothing would be far worse. Sir, he said quietly but urgently to the nearest general, a stern, silver-haired man named General Patricia Marsh, who had flown in from the Pentagon that morning, specifically out of respect for Sergeant Reyes' service. They're arresting Master Sergeant Coleman. General Marsh turned, and within 3 seconds her expression shifted from confusion to something closer to controlled fury. She stood immediately, 2 other generals rising with her, and began moving across the grass with the kind of unhurried, absolute authority that came from decades of command. Officer, General Marsh said, her voice carrying without needing to be raised, the kind of voice that had once commanded entire battalions and had no difficulty commanding a single confused patrol officer. I need you to release this man immediately. She had spent the better part of her career watching young officers and soldiers alike learn the hard way that authority without judgment was simply force looking for an excuse, and she had no patience left for watching it happen again to a man she respected deeply. Holloway turned, momentarily thrown by the sudden authority radiating from the woman approaching him, still unaware of exactly who he was speaking to. Ma'am, I need you to step back. This is a police matter. This man, General Marsh said, stopping directly in front of him, is Master Sergeant Isaiah Coleman, United States Army, retired, recipient of 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. I commanded units alongside men like him for 30 years. I am General Patricia Marsh, and I am telling you, as both a fellow service member and as someone who will be making a phone call to your chief within the next 5 minutes, that you are about to make the worst mistake of your career. Her voice never rose above a controlled, even register, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting ever could have. Holloway's confidence visibly cracked, his hand hovering uncertainly near the cuffs key now clipped to his belt. I had reports of suspicious activity, man. I was just... You were profiling a uniformed veteran at his friend's memorial service, General Marsh said flatly. Take the cuffs off, now. Holloway uncuffed Isaiah with visibly shaking hands, stammering an apology that neither Isaiah nor the gathered generals had any interest in accepting in that moment. The memorial service had effectively paused entirely. The eulogy abandoned mid-sentence, 200 mourners now standing, watching, many recording on their phones what was unfolding at the edge of the gathering meant to honor a fallen soldier. By the time Isaiah rejoined the ceremony, his wrists bearing the same red marks that countless veterans before him had described from far less honorable circumstances, General Marsh had already placed a call to the city's police chief directly, her voice carrying across the quiet park with the unmistakable weight of someone who had no intention of letting this disappear quietly. I want a full report on this officer's conduct on my desk by Monday morning, she said. And I want to understand exactly how a department charged with protecting this community allowed one of its officers to arrest a decorated combat veteran during a memorial service for a fallen soldier in front of 200 witnesses, including 3 retired general officers. Within hours, the story had reached well beyond the local community. A veterans advocacy organization, alerted by attendees who had filmed the arrest, picked up the footage and pushed it into national veteran circles, where it spread with the particular fury reserved for stories involving disrespect toward those who had served. The internal affairs investigation that followed was thorough, driven heavily by the sheer volume of pressure now bearing down on the department from veterans organizations, city officials, and the Pentagon's own public affairs office, which had taken the unusual step of issuing a formal statement expressing concern over the treatment of a decorated retired service member. Within 48 hours, the department had received over 3,000 emails from veterans, active duty service members, and military families across the country, many of them describing their own experiences of feeling unseen or disrespected despite their service, all of them demanding the same basic accountability. Investigators reviewed Holloway's body cam footage, which showed clearly that Isaiah had calmly identified himself, explained his presence at the memorial, and offered to provide identification before any physical force was applied, his tone never once rising above the steady, measured cadence of a man trained to stay calm under far worse pressure than a misunderstanding at a memorial service. The footage also captured Isaiah's uniform and ribbons in plain, unmistakable view throughout the entire interaction, details that, investigators noted, any officer with basic awareness of military insignia would have recognized immediately as signifying decorated, senior-level service. The lead investigator, a retired military police officer named Colonel James Whitford, brought in specifically for his expertise in both law enforcement protocol and military courtesy, spent considerable time in his written report explaining exactly what those ribbons represented. The campaigns, the wounds, the years of sacrifice condensed into small strips of color that Holloway had apparently never learned to read. In his interview, Holloway attempted to argue that the vague morning briefing about monitoring for unusual activity justified his approach, and further suggested that Isaiah's decision to step away from the group during the ceremony had itself appeared suspicious, regardless of his uniform. Colonel Whitford was unsparing in his response. You arrested a man wearing combat ribbons and a purple harp device for stepping away from a memorial service to retrieve a piece of paper from his car. There was no unusual activity here, Officer Holloway. There was a man grieving a friend, and an officer who saw a uniform and a face and decided within seconds that something was wrong simply because of who was wearing it. I've spent 26 years around men exactly like Master Sergeant Coleman. And I can tell you that the failure here wasn't a lack of information. It was a failure of basic attention, the kind no training manual should have had to spell out in the first place. Holloway had no meaningful response. The footage, combined with General Marsh's direct testimony and the statements of multiple honor guard members and family attendees, left the department with no viable defense, and the city's own legal counsel privately advised against contesting any portion of the resulting claim. Officer Holloway was terminated within 2 weeks, the department's termination letter explicitly citing an unjustified use of force against a decorated veteran during a solemn memorial service. reflecting a profound failure of judgment and situational awareness incompatible with continued service. He was additionally referred for state-level certification review, which suspended his ability to work in law enforcement anywhere in the state for a period of 2 years. The review board's written decision noted pointedly that the case represented a textbook failure of basic observation that any reasonably attentive officer should have avoided. The city settled with Isaiah for an undisclosed sum reported by local sources to exceed $1 million, alongside a formal apology delivered in person by the mayor at a follow-up ceremony specifically organized to honor Sergeant Reyes properly, the way the original service should have been allowed to conclude without interruption. Reyes's mother, the same woman who had asked Isaiah to speak at the original service, finally got to hear him deliver those words at the rescheduled ceremony, 3 months later than planned, but delivered all the same with the same care he had intended from the start. The department, under direct pressure from both the settlement terms and the very public involvement of 3 retired generals, instituted mandatory training on military courtesy and veteran recognition for all patrol officers, developed in direct partnership with the same veterans advocacy organization that had first amplified the story. The training program, which Colonel Whitford helped design personally, included a module specifically focused on recognizing military insignia and understanding the significance of decorations like the ones Isaiah had worn that day. A small, practical step meant to ensure no officer in that department would ever again stand in front of a Purple Heart without understanding exactly what it represented. Isaiah didn't dwell publicly on the incident for long. He returned to the same Veterans Park 3 months later for another memorial service, this time for a different fallen friend, dressed in the same Class A uniform, ribbons pinned precisely in place, helping the family set up chairs the way he always did. General Marsh attended that service too, standing quietly beside him during the eulogy, an unspoken acknowledgement between 2 people who understood exactly what respect was supposed to look like and exactly how quickly it could be denied to the people who had earned it most. Several attendees later said it was the most well-attended police community trust event the department had hosted in years, though none of them would have called it that to its organizers' faces. To them, it was simply a man finally being allowed to grieve his friend in peace. This story is a reminder that service and sacrifice can be rendered invisible in an instant by someone who never bothered to look closely enough to see them, and that real honor is measured not by the uniform someone wears, but by how that uniform is treated by the people sworn to protect the community standing in front of it. It is a lesson the department learned at considerable cost, and one that Isaiah, characteristically, never asked anyone to apologize for twice. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true stories of justice finally catching up.